In the 1870s, Hubert Howe Bancroft, a publisher in San Francisco, set out to write a multi-volume history of California and dispatched assistants to interview the Mexican residents of the state, who had important memories of the region's history. Thomas Savage, one of Bancroft's helpers, interviewed Doña Felipa Osuna de Marron. At the time, she had been a widow for 25 years. She had lived in California as a Spanish and as a Mexican subject, and vividly remembered the American conquest of her native town, San Diego. In 1846, at the beginning of the war, she married Juan Maria de Marron, a rancher appointed the administrator of Mission San Luis Rey properties. Felipa was at the former mission in the summer of 1846, when General John C. Fremont and the American troops arrived, hoping to capture Californio political leaders. The Americans questioned her about where her husband was and who else was at the mission. Don Matias Moreno, the secretary to the California government, was with Doña Felipa when the Americans appeared. Even though she greatly feared the Americans, who were not disciplined soldiers, Felipa dared to quickly disguise him as a sick cousin, fooling the Americans, who then left. Once they had departed, Don Matias, who had recognized his good friend Don Santiago Arguello, who had been riding with the Americans, sent a messenger to catch up with Arguello to tell him to return so he could join him. So Don Matias changed sides because his friend had done so. After this incident at the mission, Felipa went with her husband to their rancho in the backcountry. Later, her husband sent her alone to San Diego for safety. She recounted that in San Diego, Don Miguel de Pedrorena, Don Pedro C. Carrillo, and Arguello, along with others, were allied with the Americans. The Californios, who opposed the Americans, asked her husband to join them, and he did so. Hoping to be reunited with his family, he joined Felipa and their children in the pueblo of San Diego, which the U.S. Army then occupied. Soon they secured a safe conduct pass to leave town and fled back to their rancho. There, they found the Californios furious with her husband, accusing him of working as a courier for the Americans. They threatened to shoot him, but instead confiscated the family's horses and took the family as prisoners to another rancho. Almost every day, the Californio partisans descended on the rancho to take what they needed, driving Doña Felipa and her family to the verge of starvation. As she recalled, "Most of what we had was taken from us, including the cattle given to us by the mission fathers." When the war ended, the Californios continued to accuse Felipa and her husband of being pro-American, though they had never fought with the Americans. Their own countrymen finally forced the Osunas to ask for protection from the American commander of San Diego. Felipa and her husband journeyed from the rancho to town, and when they reached the outskirts, her husband raised a white flag. They entered the pueblo, leaving their few remaining livestock outside. Felipa reported that some Americans in San Diego were angry at the return of these Mexicans, whom they regarded as enemies, but the Americans did not punish them. These episodes, recalled by Felipa Osuna in an interview with Thomas Savage in 1878, reveal some of the schisms among the Californios over the American conquest. As evidenced by her testimony, the conquest of California was more than a military one. It extended to a struggle between friends and families. The real conquest, the transformation of the economy and society, began a few months after the war's end with the discovery of gold. Within a year, thousands of immigrants from the United States, Latin America, Europe, and Asia overwhelmed the native peoples and the Californios. Virtually overnight, they created a new society that was entirely alien to Felipa Osuna and her family. The war between the United States and Mexico. On the eve of the war between the United States and Mexico, the northern states and the provinces of the Mexican Republic were increasingly being influenced by American commercial interests. The opening of the Santa Fe Trail in the 1820s and the increase in Yankee hide and tallow ships in California created new economic ties with the Mexican upper classes. In 1836, the Anglo-Americans in Texas had waged a war of independence from Mexico and declared themselves a sovereign state, the Lone Star Republic. The Texans longed to join the United States, but were prevented from doing so until 1845 because of opposition from Northerners, who feared adding another slave state. In the interim, the Texans carried on a thriving trade between their ranches in central Texas and Louisiana. In 1842, they unsuccessfully tried to conquer New Mexico to add its lands to their new republic. Finally, in 1845, the United States admitted Texas to the Union as a slave state, with the Texans asserting that their southern boundary was the Rio Grande. Mexico, on the other hand, pointed out that the historic boundary between Texas and the province of Coahuila had always been the Nueces River. The friction between these two claims provided the spark that eventually led to an armed conflict between US and Mexican troops in 1846. There had been other rebellions in Mexico's northern provinces. In 1837, the lower classes in New Mexico led a rebellion against the Mexican government's centralizing administration, seeking more autonomy for their village governments. The Mexican upper classes soon crushed this rebellion, but they too had their grievances with the Mexican government, primarily its strict trade regulations. The merchants and other wealthy people of northern New Mexico grew to depend on the manufactured goods brought to them over the Santa Fe Trail. The value of goods brought overland from St. Louis increased every year, and Hispano trading families in Santa Fe grew rich. Meanwhile, the upper classes knew from past experience that the unstable Mexican government would not be able to preserve their interests. The Californios were also dissatisfied with the Mexican government, see Chapter 3, and had deposed several Mexican governors, replacing them with their own native-born hijos de país. The rebellion of 1836, which placed Juan Bautista Alvarado in power, increased the self-confidence of Californio landholders that they could control their own affairs. They were growing wealthy from the hide and tallow trade, much of it illicitly conducted with American, British and French ships, and some of them talked openly about separating from Mexico and joining the United States. Though the upper classes in the Mexican North were growing more and more economically dependent on the Americans, and some of them were contemplating political separation, the vast majority of the more than 100,000 Mexican citizens who lived on the frontier, including Hispanicized Indians, were opposed to being forcibly annexed by the United States. They valued their independence and cherished their culture. When the war came, most realized what was being lost, and they fought back. Manifest Destiny. In May 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico. Though there were many causes of this conflict, perhaps the most important was the spirit of expansionism called Manifest Destiny. Thousands of Anglo-Americans believed it was God's will that they move west and north across the entire North American continent, occupying the lands of the Mexicans and Indians and casting them aside in the process. As John O'Sullivan, editor of the Democratic Review and popularizer of the term Manifest Destiny, wrote in 1845, "The Anglo-Americans alone will cover the immense space contained between the polar regions and the tropics." For most, however, Manifest Destiny had an economic dimension, justifying a more efficient use of natural resources by the industrious Anglo-Saxons. Mixed in with this sentiment of justifiable economic conquest were attitudes of the racial superiority of the Anglo-American people. Walt Whitman, the poet, expressed this view in 1846 when he wrote, "What has miserable, inefficient Mexico, with her superstition, her burlesque upon freedom, her actual tyranny by the few over the many? What has she to do with the peopling of the New World, with a noble race? Be it ours to achieve that mission." Or, as a writer for the New York Evening Post put it in 1845, "The Mexicans are Aboriginal Indians, and they must share the destiny of their race." Beginning with Andrew Jackson's presidency in the 1830s, successive American administrations had offered to purchase California from Mexico to give the United States a window on the Pacific and to fulfill the nation's destiny. Mexico had repeatedly refused these offers. In 1845, President James K. Polk sent John Slidell to make yet another offer to purchase California and to settle a dispute over the boundary between Texas and Mexico. The Mexican government refused. President Polk offered as justification for his declaration of war on Mexico that the Mexican government rejected Slidell's offer of $40 million for the purchase of California. There were other, more immediate causes as well. Texas had been annexed as a state in 1845, but the Mexican government did not accept the Rio Grande as the southern boundary of Texas. In the spring of 1846, Mexican troops attacked Zachary Taylor's troops on what they believed was their own country's soil. President Polk claimed these skirmishes were proof of a Mexican invasion of the United States. On May 13, 1846, he asked Congress for a declaration of war. In his war message, he recalled the failed attempts at negotiating grievances between the two countries and blamed Mexico for starting the war. As war exists, he argued, and notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it, exists by the act of Mexico herself, we are called upon by every consideration of duty and patriotism to vindicate with decision the honor, the rights, and the interests of our country. Though a large vote in Congress passed the declaration of war, there were opponents. Some Southerners, including John C. Calhoun, feared that a war with Mexico would result in renewed conflict over slavery in the territories and would admit to the Union a new class of non-white citizens, a dangerous precedent for the slaveholding South. Some Northerners opposed the war because they viewed it as a conspiracy of slave owners trying to acquire new lands to expand their peculiar institution. Some of them, including Henry David Thoreau and Abraham Lincoln, also opposed the war on moral grounds since, in their view, the United States was the aggressor nation. An important factor in the agitation for war was the desire of many American expansionists to annex California. The value of California's harbors for the Chinese trade and the threat of possible British or French occupation of this area combined to heighten interest in acquiring not only California, but all of the territory between California and Texas, the present-day states of New Mexico and Arizona, and parts of Nevada, Utah, and Colorado as well. In 1844, presidential candidate Polk listed the acquisition of California as one of the objectives of his presidential administration. The Californios had been aware for some time of the expansionist designs of the Americanos. The mistaken capture of Monterey by Commodore Thomas Ap Catesby Jones in 1842 sounded a clear warning of the expansionist objectives of the United States. The U.S. consul in Monterey, Thomas Larkin, had been sending letters to Washington discussing the possibility of annexation with the cooperation of progressive Californios and American émigrés who believed the United States would best guarantee their political and economic independence. President Polk commissioned Larkin as a secret agent in 1845 to convince the Californio leadership to break away from Mexico and join the United States. Larkin noted that Mariano Vallejo and General José Castro were predisposed toward independence from Mexico and union with the United States. But in the spring of 1846, Polk's strategy of acquiring California through peaceful intrigue disintegrated, a casualty of agitation for war and the violent actions of Americans in California. Fremont and the Bear Flaggers. John Charles Fremont, whose father was a French émigré and whose mother was the daughter of a prominent Virginian family, grew up with a burning desire to be famous. He married Jessie Benton, daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, a powerful U.S. senator. Fremont, like his father-in-law, sought to advance his career by promoting Western expansion. In 1842, 1843, and again in 1845, Fremont led expeditions across the Rockies into California and Oregon, earning the name Pathfinder. In the winter of 1845–46, Fremont, by then commissioned as a lieutenant in the Army Corps of Chapter 4, War, Conquest and Gold, the American Era, begins, 1845–1855. Topographical engineers entered California with 62 men and a howitzer cannon. They camped near Monterey. Ostensibly, he was on a mapping expedition, But even today, the real purpose of his mission is unclear. Historians have debated whether Fremont was on a secret presidential mission to accomplish the conquest of California. No hard evidence, however, has ever been found to prove that he was part of a plot to separate California from Mexico. Perhaps his actions in California during the early 1846 were his own initiatives and not directed by secret orders. In any case, his subsequent actions did assist the American military conquest of California. When Fremont arrived in California in the spring of 1846, he told General Castro, the military commander of the North, that he was on a scientific expedition. Castro, however, suspected otherwise and ordered Fremont and his men to leave the province. For 3 days, Fremont hesitated. He had his men fortify their positions atop Gavilan Hill near Monterey and defiantly raise the American flag. But after several days of consulting with Oliver Larkin, the U.S. consul in Monterey, and seeing the Mexicans prepare for an attack, Fremont wisely decided to remove his troops from the area and to heed Castro's orders. He and his men slowly withdrew from California, marching toward Oregon. Upon reaching Klamath Lake, Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie arrived from Washington, D.C., bringing letters from Senator Thomas Hart Benton. Some historians suspect that Gillespie may have also brought oral instructions from President Polk himself to assist in the impending conquest of California by arms. We will never know what was said, but soon after Gillespie's arrival, Fremont ordered his men to march back to California. In May, he camped near present-day Marysville, a short march from Sutter's Fort. In the following days, small groups of Americans came to Fremont's camp. They told him of rumors that General Castro was preparing an army to expel all Americans from California. On June 8th, acting on rumors of a possible California military action against the American settlers at Sutter's Fort, Fremont sent a message to William Ide, one of their leaders, suggesting they come to his camp for protection. On June 10th, some 12 or 14 Americans led by Ezekiel Merritt launched a revolt against the Mexican government, capturing approximately 170 horses that were being driven from Sacramento to Santa Clara for use by General Castro's troops. They now had a choice, either be horse thieves or revolutionaries. They chose the latter. They released the Mexicans leading the horses, telling them to tell Castro that the Americans captured Sonoma and New Helvetia, Sutter's Fort. Then they returned to Fremont's camp with the horses. Ide remembered that Fremont had encouraged the horse raid and presented a plan of conquest to the American settlers, which he would support but not participate in directly. The horse thieves then set out for Sonoma, the residence of General Mariano Vallejo, one of the most powerful Californios, and a man who had already voiced his support for American annexation. In the early morning hours of June 14, 1846, 33 rough and dirty men descended on Vallejo's home and forced their way into his parlor, demanding the surrender of his command of the Mexican military forces in the region. Jacob P. Lease, Vallejo's brother-in-law, acted as an interpreter. The mob slowly learned that Vallejo was an ally, but they wanted to surrender. Negotiations dragged on, and with typical California hospitality, Vallejo broke out the aguardiente, brandy. The mob proceeded to get drunk, and after a while someone put together a homemade flag, a grizzly bear with a red star on a white field. William Ide declared their intention to break away from Mexican despotism and establish a republic like Texas in 1836. With their flag, the Proclamation of Independence, and a surrender document, the Bear Flaggers marched to Fremont's camp with their prisoners, Vallejo, his brother Salvador, Lease, and Victor Proudhon, a French resident of Sonoma. Then, with Fremont's men as an escort, they proceeded to Sutter's Fort, where Fremont assumed responsibility for the prisoners. In the few days after the capture of Sonoma, the Bear Flaggers had also killed 3 Californios in a skirmish near San Rafael, and the Mexican army had executed 2 Americans near the Russian River. Fremont joined the rebellion through his words and then through his actions. Within a few weeks, his unofficial actions gained the approval of the US government as news reached California of the declaration of war with Mexico. The Bear Flaggers were then incorporated into the US Army. Occupation and resistance. Congress declared war against Mexico on May 13, 1846, but news of the war travelled slowly. Commodore John D. Sloat, in charge of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, had orders to occupy the California harbors in the event of war. Upon hearing of the war declaration, he ordered his ships to sail into Monterey Bay on July 2nd. However, he did not immediately capture the town, remembering the earlier embarrassment of Commodore Jones. He waited 5 days until learning of the Bear Flag Rebellion. Fearing a British move to seize California, he raised the American flag over the customs house. He told the startled populace that henceforward California will be a portion of the United States. Sloat reassured the Californios that they would benefit from being part of the United States, and he called on General Castro and Governor Pio Pico to surrender. On July 23rd, because of ill health, Sloat turned over his command to Commodore Robert F. Stockton, a politically ambitious naval officer. Stockton immediately commissioned Fremont and Gillespie as officers in the newly formed California Battalion, composed of Fremont's company of engineers plus a contingent of former Bear Flaggers. The bulk of the fighting in the conquest of California took place in the South. In the summer of 1846, General Castro and Governor Pico joined forces in Los Angeles to await the American advance, but they soon concluded that they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Both leaders departed for Mexico to seek reinforcements. Meanwhile, Fremont and Gillespie sailed for San Diego and occupied the town on July 29th, after some brief resistance. California still controlled the surrounding countryside and continued to harass the occupiers. Commodore Stockton marched south from Monterey, and following a skirmish, his troops occupied Los Angeles on August 13, 1846. After issuing another proclamation stating that California was now officially part of the United States and promising to respect Mexican political institutions and laws, Stockton and Fremont returned north. It left the occupation of Los Angeles in the hands of Gillespie and about 50 soldiers. What followed was a wave of Mexican California resistance against the American invaders. In Los Angeles, the American troops entered private homes and took household goods. Gillespie enforced a strict curfew and forbade Californios from meeting in groups. Resentment grew until an uprising occurred on September 22, 1846, led by José María Flores and Cérbulo Varela. Several hundred Californios surrounded the American fortified position, and Californio leaders issued El Plan de Los Angeles, calling on all Mexicans to fight against the Americans who were threatening to reduce them to a condition worse than that of slaves. With only 50 men in his command, Gillespie saw that his situation was hopeless, and on September 29th, he signed the Articles of Capitulation. The Americans were then allowed to leave the Los Angeles district and march to San Pedro. Soon after, the new California governor, José María Flores, declared California in a state of siege, secured loans to pay for a war, and began recruiting more troops. For the next 4 months, Los Angeles remained in California's hands, and its military forces also managed to reoccupy San Diego, Santa Barbara, Santa Ynez, and San Luis Obispo. Flores sent Francisco Rico, Cérbulo Varela, and 50 men from Los Angeles to recapture San Diego. This was done without firing a shot in October 1846. They held the town for 3 weeks until October 24, 1846, when the Americans recaptured it after a brief battle. According to one eyewitness, the Americans hauled down the Mexican flag. Still, before it could touch the ground, Maria Antonia Machado, wife of a local ranchero, rushed into the plaza to save it from being trampled. She clutched it to her bosom and cut the halyards to prevent the American flag from being raised. In their military forays against the American troops, the Californios had the advantage of knowing the terrain and being superior horsemen. The Americans had superior weapons and formal military training. but the Californios used guerrilla tactics and effectively won several victories. The Californio Lancers won battles at Chico Rancho, September 26 and 27, 1846, Dominguez Rancho, October 8, Natividad, November 29th, and finally at San Pascual, December 8th. The Battle of San Pascual was the bloodiest battle fought in California. It was a victory for the Californio forces and evidence of their determination to resist the American conquest. Early in December, Andres Pico and a force of 72 Californios waited for the Americans, rumoured to be approaching from the east. A large body of American troops under General Stephen W. Kearny had entered California after marching overland from New Mexico. Kearny's men numbered 179, including several Delaware Indian scouts led by Kit Carson and a few African-American servants of the officers and mule drivers. Early in the morning of December 6, 1846, the American force attacked the Californio camp in the Indian village of San Pascual. During the charge, the Americans became strung out in a long file, with those on stronger mules and horses outdistancing those on tired mounts. The few gunshots exchanged were in this first charge, as the Californio troops met the early arrivals some distance from their camp. The Californios raced away, allowing themselves to be chased for about 3/4 of a mile. They then turned and charged the Americans with their lances. It had been raining occasionally for several days, and the Americans' gunpowder was damp and unreliable, forcing them to fight with their sabres. The Californios were armed with long lances and were experts at using them to slaughter cattle. In hand-to-hand combat, the Californios had the advantage of superior mounts, weapons and battle preparation. Only about half of the American force was involved in the battle. The others were in reserve guarding the supplies and baggage. The Americans were unfamiliar with their newly issued carbines and had trouble loading these guns in the dark and cold. The two groups fought most of the battle, about half an hour, in the dim light and fog. During the battle, the Californios captured one of the American cannons. Finally, the Americans brought up another howitzer, firing at the Californios and causing them to retreat. 19 American soldiers were dead on the field of battle. 2 more died later from their wounds. Kearny himself suffered 3 lance wounds and temporarily relieved himself of command. The Californios had 11 wounded, and one of their group, Pablo Veja, was taken prisoner. Some of the American deaths may have been from friendly fire in the dim light and confusion. Only one American was killed by a bullet. General Kearny later wrote that the Battle of December 6th had been a victory and that the Californios had fled from the field. One US soldier, however, wrote that the Americans had been saved from decimation by the Californios' capture of the American howitzer, an act that made the Californios consider themselves victorious, which saved the balance of the command. Later, at the court-martial of General Fremont, Kearny admitted that a rescue party from San Diego had saved them from disaster. Generally, the Navy officers, headed by Stockton, considered the Battle of San Pascual a defeat for the US Army. Of course, the Californios considered this engagement a victory, and the news spread throughout the district. A month later, on January 29, 1847, another overland army arrived in San Diego. This was the Mormon Battalion, commissioned by the US Army to survey a wagon road between Santa Fe and San Diego. The 350 soldiers travelled more than 1,000 miles on foot, but arrived too late to participate in the war's final battles in California. Their numbers augmented a small contingent of Mormons who had settled in Southern California near San Bernardino. California Indians and the War. During the Mexican War, some California Indian groups increased their raids on the California ranchos, taking advantage of the weakened defense of the Mexican settlements. The Californios thought the Americans were behind the increased Indian depredations, but the majority of the attacks were probably the work of opportunists who took advantage of wartime chaos. In the early months of the war, though, California Indians did join the Americans. When Commodore Stockton organized his march in San Diego to recapture Los Angeles from the California insurgents, more than 100 Indians formed his rear guard to protect the U.S. Army from possible attack. Fremont recruited a small number of local Indians to join his men as he marched from Monterey to San Luis Obispo. Edward Kern, the American commander at Sutter's Fort, recruited 200 California and Oregon Indians to help secure the North and prepare for Southern California's reconquest. A major tragedy involving the natives and the Californios during the war was the Palmer Massacre in Southern California. A few days after the Battle of San Pasqual, 11 Californio men and youths took refuge in an adobe house on Rancho Palma, owned by José Antonio Serrano. While there, they were tricked into allowing themselves to be captured by Luiseño Indians led by Manuelito Cota. The Indians took the men as prisoners to Warner's Ranch. There they consulted with a Mexican named Higuera and William Marshall, an American who had married the daughter of a local Indian chieftain. After a short captivity, the captives were tortured to death by thrusts of red-hot spears. Later rumors strongly implicated Marshall in the murders. He hated one of the prisoners, José María Alvarado, who had successfully courted Doña Lugarda Osuna, once the object of Marshall's affections. Marshall may have suggested that the Americans would reward the Indians for disposing of the Californios. Not all Indians supported uprisings against the Mexicans. Within days of the capture of the Californios, a force of natives from San Pasqual who were loyal to the Mexican cause set out to rescue the captives, but they arrived too late. After learning of the massacre, a punitive force of 22 Californios immediately set out with a force of friendly Cahuilla Indians. They ambushed a Luiseño force, killed more than 100, and took 20 captives, whom the Cahuillas later killed. The massacre of the Californios at Rancho Palma illustrated both the persistence of native animosities toward the Mexicans and the possible manipulation of Indian hatred by the Americans. News of this massacre, along with memories of previous uprisings and knowledge that the Indians vastly outnumbered the Californios and Mexicans, may have worked to demoralize the Californio resistance movement. Peace. Despite the Californios' valiant though somewhat hopeless resistance against the American invaders, the American forces had recaptured all of Southern California by the winter of 1847. Following defeating the last Californio army near Los Angeles, Andrés Pico signed a surrender agreement at Cahuenga Pass on January 13, 1847. Elsewhere in the southwest, however, resistance continued. In New Mexico, the Taos Indians, in alliance with some of the Hispano families, rebelled against the American occupiers, killed the American military governor Charles Bent, and recaptured some of the towns in northern New Mexico. On January 24, 1847, a Hispano-Indian army of 1,500 met the Americans at La Cañada near Santa Fe, New Mexico, and were defeated. The Americans marched on the town of Mora and destroyed it, then marched south to surround Taos Pueblo, where the remnants of the resistance had entrenched themselves. In the days that followed, more than 150 defenders were killed and their leaders were captured. 15 were tried and convicted of conspiracy, murder, and treason in a display of mock justice. This marked the end of armed resistance in the Southwest. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In Mexico, the fight against the American invaders killed tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians in massive clashes of armies, at first in the north, near Monterrey, Mexico, and then in the Valley of Mexico. By January 1847, the U.S. Army, commanded by General Winfield Scott, occupied Mexico City and waited to hear the results of peace negotiations. Pressed by European creditors, lacking money to pay their own troops, racked by internal rebellion, and facing the occupation of their principal cities, the Mexican government had little choice but to sign a treaty of peace, giving in to the Americans' territorial demands in exchange for the removal of troops from their homeland. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the war, was signed in a town near Mexico City across the street from the shrine to the patron saint of Mexico, Our Lady of Guadalupe, on February 2, 1848. Among the provisions in the treaty were those specifying the new boundary between the two nations as starting one marine league due south of the southernmost point of the port of San Diego and running east to the Colorado River, then east following the Gila River, and an as yet undefined latitude line to the Rio Grande. The Mexican provinces of California and New Mexico now lay within the United States. Articles 8 and 9 of the treaty gave assurances regarding the property and citizenship rights of the Mexicans in the newly conquered territories. Article 8 specifically promised to protect absentee Mexican landholders' rights and give U.S. citizenship to all Mexicans who wanted it. Article 9 promised that Congress would give citizenship at the proper time, and that the Mexicans in the meantime shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty and property, and secured in the free exercise of their religion without restriction. Finally, the treaty transferred more than 500,000 square miles of Mexican territory to the United States. The final ratified version of the treaty omitted Article X, which had contained stronger language protecting land rights, namely, that all grants of land made by the Mexican government or by the competent authorities in territories previously appertaining to Mexico shall be respected as valid to the same extent if said territories had remained within the limits of Mexico. The deletion of this article proved fatal to the future of the Mexican landholders in California. In place of the deleted article, the final treaty included the Protocol of Querétaro, promising to respect land grant titles, but the United States Supreme Court ultimately invalidated it. The US-Mexican War awakened new nationalist impulses within Mexico and eventually produced a reform movement led by Benito Juárez in the 1850s. In the United States, the Mexican Cession provoked a new and heated debate over slavery in the newly acquired territories. This played a major role in the outbreak of the US Civil War in 1861. The bloodiest conflict in American history. Within the conquered territories, there were competing visions regarding the territory's future. The California tribes outnumbered the whites, despite the influx of hundreds of American soldiers. Most natives remained unaffected by the war, particularly those living in their traditional homelands away from the settled coastal regions. A few had joined the Americans as scouts and guides during the conflict. Even fewer capitalized on the war to settle old grievances against the Mexicans. Native peoples who had become Hispanicized and who worked on the ranchos and in the pueblos now found themselves with more aggressive masters, the Americans. Indian laborers were still the backbone of the agricultural and ranching industries, and the new American masters inherited a dependence on this labor force. The divided mind of the Californios. On the eve of the American era, the Spanish-speaking Mexicans in California were divided in their attitudes about their status as Americans. Some, like Mariano Vallejo or Juan Bandini, were optimistic about their future under an American regime that they thought would bring political stability and increased commercial opportunities for all. They couldn't envision how much their traditional way of life would change. For now, they saw what seemed to be a new opportunity for their enrichment. Others, like Pio Pico, who had been allowed to return to California, or Felipe Osuna de Maron in San Diego, viewed the American occupiers with great suspicion. They felt sure that the conquest meant more than just the transfer of political sovereignty, for they were aware of the differences between the two cultures and knew they could not coexist easily. Finally, there were the young men who had fought against the Americans in various battles, or who almost immediately felt the outrages of racism as the Americans took over their houses and lands. Cérbulo Varela, leader of the recapture of Los Angeles in 1847, along with Salomon Pico, Juan Flores, and scores of other ex-soldiers, became outlaws rather than submit to the Americans. In subsequent decades, their violent actions in response to the American occupation became the source of legend. It soon became apparent to the Californios that the new American masters believed in their own racial and cultural superiority, and that they regarded the mestizo landless classes as little better than Indians. The conflicts between these two groups became evident as thousands of new immigrants flooded Northern California, attracted by the discovery of gold near Sacramento. The Gold Rush. In 1842, Francisco Lopez discovered gold in the San Francisco Canyon in Southern California. Hundreds of gold miners trekked north from Sonora to work the mines there for several years. They scoured the riverbanks in a 20-square-mile area. Mining the deposits depended on water, which diminished in quantity as the number of miners increased. By 1843, about 2,000 ounces of gold had been removed from the canyon. While gold continued to be mined in subsequent years, eventually it played out. This first California gold rush paled compared to the impact of the discovery of gold on January 24, 1848. Gold, the discovery of 1848. James W. Marshall, an employee of John Sutter, was building a sawmill on the American River at Coloma. Sutter had employed about 50 former members of the Mormon Battalion who had drifted north from San Diego, along with a group of Indian laborers. Marshall noticed a few gold-colored flecks while cutting a ditch to produce water for the mill. He collected them over a 4-day period, then hurried to Sutter's fort to consult with Sutter. Together they read an encyclopedia entry on gold and performed primitive tests to confirm whether or not it was the precious metal. Sutter concluded that it was in fact gold, but he was very anxious that the discovery would not disrupt his plans for construction and farming. At the same time, he set about gaining legitimate title to as much land near the discovery as possible. Although Sutter sought to keep his discovery a secret, word leaked out when he sent Charles Bennett to Monterey to secure title to the land and its mineral rights. Bennett travelled as far as Benicia, where he bragged about discovering gold at a local store. Then he confided with acquaintances with gold mining experience in San Francisco. Meanwhile, Samuel Brannan, a former Mormon leader who owned a store near Sutter's fort, found that local workers were paying for supplies with small quantities of gold dust. The Mormon workers gave him a tithe in gold, and when Brannan returned to San Francisco, he publicized the news, running through the streets with a bottle of gold dust in one hand and waving his hat, shouting, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" Nevertheless, the importance of this discovery was not immediately appreciated. As late as May 1848, San Francisco newspapers were blasé about the possibility of a gold field somewhere on the American River. By June, however, the fever caught hold. Hundreds of Californios and American settlers quit their ranchos and jobs and raced to the new diggings. San Francisco, San Jose, and Monterey became ghost towns overnight. Stores selling pans, picks, shovels, and other mining implements did a tremendous business, and prices rose accordingly. Lucina Stanley Wilson, who came with her husband and family to the gold rush country, remembered selling her freshly made biscuits for $5 each. Soul dyers, prisoners, politicians, ministers, young and old, all abandoned their families and occupations to set out for the diggings. As fate would have it, the Mexican government had ratified the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo a few months before confirming a gold strike in California. News of the discovery reached northern Mexico in the summer of 1848, and hundreds of Sonoran miners immediately headed for Alta California. They had experience in gold mining, unlike the Anglo-Americans and foreigners. In the fall of 1848, roughly 6,000 miners, many Sonorans, entered California and set up mining camps along the American River. The first American miners to arrive knew nothing about gold mining and learned their mining techniques from the Mexicans. At first, life in the diggings was generally orderly and peaceable. Alonzo Delano, one of the so-called 48ers, remembered that at that time, property was safer in California than in the older states. Bancroft, the publisher and historian from San Francisco, could only find 2 cases of robbery in all of the mining camps in 1848. But this soon changed. The Argonauts. News of the gold strike in California rapidly spread, first to Hawaii, Oregon, and Utah, then to South America, Australia, China, the eastern seaboard of the United States, and Europe. By December 1848, President Polk publicly delivered a speech to Congress confirming the discovery of gold and interpreted it as confirming God's favor for the war against Mexico. In 1849, about 100,000 immigrants from around the world, especially from the eastern United States, flooded Northern California, forever changing the state's destiny. Overnight, it seemed, San Francisco was transformed into an international city, a transfer point for miners and mining supplies. The pastoral life of the Californios in the north declined. At the same time, the rancheros of the south enjoyed a brief flare of prosperity as their cattle increased in value with the demand for food from the mining camps and the growing population of the north. By 1850, 1/4 of California's population was foreign-born. Many were Latin American or Mexican. The gold rush was an international affair, attracting people worldwide. Chinese immigrants came, mostly after 1849. They were young men from southeastern China, big cities like Hong Kong, Canton, and the countryside. To pay for their trip to the Gold Mountain, as they called California, these men indentured themselves to Chinese companies that, in turn, sold their labor to Chinese mining operations. Laboring long hours with very low pay, the Chinese miners were virtual slaves until their debt was repaid, which often took years. By 1852, more than 25,000 Chinese lived in Northern California, the mining camps, and San Francisco. 2/3 of the new population attracted to California during the gold rush came from the eastern United States and were a multi-ethnic group of Scottish, French, Irish, German, and British descent. They called themselves the Argonauts, after the mythical Greek adventurers who travelled to the edge of the known world in search of a fabled golden fleece. In 1849 and subsequent years, they came to California by boat, wagon, horseback, and even foot, enduring grueling and dangerous passages. This mass migration to California is one of the most documented population movements in world history, with hundreds of letters, diaries, and reminiscences penned along the way and after arrival at the mines. Those who chose to travel by boat had to pick between two routes. One was by ship from New York to Panama, then by smaller ship up the fever-infested Chagres River, and then by mule over the mountains to the Pacific port of Panama. There they transferred to another ship bound for San Francisco. This voyage could last from 2 to 3 months, depending on connections. The longest delays were usually on the Pacific side of the Panamanian Isthmus, where, in the early years, there were rarely enough ships to carry the numbers who thronged the port seeking passage. The other route to California by sea involved going around Cape Horn, the stormy southern tip of South America. The demand for travel around the Horn stimulated a boom in constructing clipper ships. Built for speed, these remarkable vessels were long and thin and carried huge amounts of sail on 3 tall masts. Accommodations were small and narrow, with low ceilings that many had to bend over when moving about. One of the most notable clippers was the Flying Cloud, which, on its first voyage, took only 89 days to sail from New York to San Francisco. Those choosing one of the sea routes had to contend with shipwrecks, shipboard diseases of all kinds, and if they selected the Panama route, death by yellow fever or malaria. The overland route was the cheapest way to get to California, costing between $100 and $200. Nevertheless, it was still relatively expensive. For comparison purposes, the daily wage of a New York City labourer in 1850 was less than $1. Anthony Powers of Green Spring, Wisconsin, borrowed $125 to finance an overland journey to the gold fields. Another group from Monroe, Michigan, collected $2,500 to pay for 10 people to make the journey. Though it was the most time-consuming route, it was the one most American migrants chose. The California immigrants of the 1840s had already blazed several trails, and the Spanish and Mexicans had used others for centuries. The southern route, the Santa Fe Trail, ran from the Missouri River through Kansas to New Mexico and followed the Spanish Trail from New Mexico to Southern California. This route had the advantage of avoiding the snow of the Sierras. A more direct way was the northern route, the choice of most because it was better known to English speakers due to guidebooks that had been published. An estimated 25,000 immigrants followed the northern route, leaving towns along the Missouri River as soon as the spring grasses were long enough to provide food for their oxen and horses. They followed the Platte River west into what is now southern Wyoming, crossed the Rocky Mountains through a series of passes, and came down in the Great Basin near Salt Lake. From there they went west to the Humboldt River Valley, across the desert to the Sierras, and once over those forbidding peaks to Sacramento. The journey from Missouri to California lasted 4 to 5 months, depending on the route selected and the luck they encountered. The dangers faced by the 49ers going to California on the Overland Trail included death by cholera and mountain fever, starvation and dehydration. Very few died from Indian attacks, which were rare. Most native peoples were content to watch in bemusement as wagon after wagon of white eyes drove themselves westward with fanatic zeal, abandoning many of their prized possessions to lighten their load. Milas Gay, an overland Argonaut, described one scene. Such destruction of property as I saw across the desert I have never seen. I should think I passed the carcasses of 1,200 head of cattle and horses and many wagons, harnesses, cooking utensils, tools, water casks. We also saw many men on the point of starvation begging for bread. The phrase "seeing the elephant" described the excitement of new adventure but also referred to the delusional state many experienced on the trail. Once in California, the 49ers, as they called themselves, began trying to strike it rich. They laboured to separate sand from gold along riverbeds by sloshing gravel in a pan filled with water, knowing that the heavier gold dust settled to the bottom. The miners soon developed elaborate systems, but the technique still involved washing sand or dirt with water and permitting the heavier gold to settle out. Wooden cradles rocked gravel and water back and forth to separate the gold. Sluices ran a stream of water over a long wooden trough partially filled with gravel. Miners used such methods to take out more than $200 million of gold between 1848 and 1852. To put this into perspective, this amount of gold was roughly equal to the total value of all gold and silver money in circulation in the entire nation at the beginning of the gold rush, and is equivalent to almost $2 billion today. By mid-1850, the most easily available gold was gone. The miners continued to use pans and long toms, sluices, but they found less and less gold to reward their labour. Some fortune seekers began to return home or to follow the lure of quick riches to new gold strikes elsewhere. Others turned to more elaborate methods of mining. By one estimate, a typical gold seeker averaged $20 of gold in a day in 1848, but only $2 worth by 1853. As miners moved farther and farther from streams, and as streams diminished in late summer, miners found they had to expend greater efforts diverting water to their claims. By 1855, miners or water companies had built more than 4,000 miles of artificial waterways, mostly wooden channels called flumes. One technique to get more gold was to use water diverted from rivers and streams for hydraulic mining. Reasoning that the gold dust in the riverbeds had washed there from the mountains, gold seekers began to look for gold in the foothills. Rather than digging through tons of soil and gravel over the prehistoric stream beds, gold seekers began to use water under pressure to blast it away. They developed huge water cannons that could blast away fully grown trees and giant boulders and reduce an entire hillside to bedrock. After bombardment by water cannons, sand and gravel were suspended in water and run through sluices, permitting the gold to settle to the bottom and the tailings, small rocks of no value, to flow into nearby rivers. This hydraulic method was far more expensive than placer mining, but by 1870, 22% of all gold produced in California was obtained by hydraulic mining. As thousands and tens of thousands of gold seekers converged on the gold country, they found a region far removed from traditional law or political authority structures. The military governor was far away, and Mexican political authority had never extended into the foothills of the Sierras. Gold seekers first formed their own political authority by developing rough guidelines regarding claims. A gold seeker could preempt a likely spot by staking a claim, but the consensus was that the claim was valid only if a single person could work on the area it covered and only if someone was working on it. Most mining camps elected someone to arbitrate their differences. The Mexican term alcalde often called this person. Such people functioned as unofficial justices of the peace, trying wrongdoers and prescribing punishment for crimes. Few such magistrates had much training in the law, if any, and many gained reputations for eccentric decisions or blatant discrimination against foreigners, Californios, or Indians. If someone were accused of a serious crime, most mining camps carried out a semblance of a jury trial, though usually with little reference to established legal principles. Without sheriffs or jails, sentences for theft were usually either banishment, often with a shaved head, flogging, branding, or mutilation, such as cutting off the thief's ears. Murder and horse theft were usually punished by hanging. One of the first such hangings came in January 1849 in a camp thereafter known as Hangtown, later renamed Placerville. Though some pun punishments resulted from a process much like a jury trial, others were simply lynchings in which a mob, sometimes drunken, acted as judge, jury, and executioner in one. Though rough and ready justice may have seemed appropriate in the absence of legally constituted political authority, some mining camps continued in such fashion even when a properly authorized judge or sheriff was present. In 1851, in the town of Sonora, for example, a mob overpowered the sheriff and lynched a confessed thief. Soon after, the miners formed a vigilance committee. Unlike a lynch mob, which was spontaneous and poorly organized, a vigilance committee was organized, claimed to represent leading citizens of the community, and justified its existence by claiming that the officials responsible for punishing wrongdoers were either corrupt or incompetent, or both. Members of such a committee were called vigilantes. Led by their committee of vigilance, Sonorans banished an American thief and a French counterfeiter. They flogged and banished 4 Mexicans, 2 for counterfeiting, 1 for horse theft, and 1 for stealing a pistol, and 1 Australian for theft of a mule. Vigilance committees sprouted in many other mining camps in the early and mid-1850s. Lynch mobs also continued to take justice into their own hands. In 1855, for example, in Colombia, a mob took an accused murderer out of the hands of the sheriff and hanged him. Such actions were not limited to mining communities. Both Stockton and Sacramento experienced lynchings in 1850. The new emerging society spread outwards from the gold fields of the north, which encompassed an inland area in the San Joaquin Valley, bounded by the Sierra Nevada mountains on the east and joined by the rivers that drained into the San Francisco Bay. Hundreds of settlements sprang up overnight with names that reflected their cultural tenor: Hangtown, Placerville, Spanish Diggings, Sonora, and El Dorado. See map on page 112. The town of Sacramento grew up to provide food and supplies to the mining district. Similarly, the port city of Stockton, almost 100 miles from the Pacific Ocean but located on the navigable San Joaquin River, grew to feed the new population. San Francisco, of course, owed its sudden urbanization to the gold rush migrants and economy. Overnight, its population went from a few hundred souls to more than 40,000 in the last months of 1848. Within a short time, it would become the cultural and economic capital of the state. Camp life. The rough and tumble life in the mining camps that sprang up along the banks of the rivers in northern and central California challenged the morals and standards of living many miners brought with them from the east. Boredom and homesickness typified the early months in the camps, as the miners began to miss the creature and family comforts of home. Edmund Booth of Iowa wrote in 1850, "Cal is a world upside down, nothing like home comforts and joys." He was referring to the fact that in the gold fields, the normal relations between genders, races and classes were all mixed up. Indians, Africans and Mexicans shared tents, food and amusements with Australians, Frenchmen and Yankees. Men did the cooking and washing, and the boundaries between respectable women and prostitutes seemed irrelevant. Men who had never cooked or done domestic work before found themselves planning their menus around trips to distant stores. They worried about infestations of lice and fleas and feared diseases such as scurvy and dysentery. New Yorker Howard Gardner recalled that he and his fellow miners lived more like pigs than human beings. Those few miners who were fortunate to have a woman in their dwelling bragged to the others about their food and comfort. To relieve the monotony of camp life, the miners created leisure activities that they might have avoided back home. Sometimes it seemed that everyone was eager to, in the words of Charles Davis, join the ranks of Satan and spend their Sabbaths with little or no restraint. Leisure activities associated with sex, liquor, gambling, and other amusements filled the gaps in miners' lives. The mixed races and classes prevailed in these activities, in the fandango hall, the bordello, and the saloon. Gold Rush diaries describe the moral anguish miners felt, mostly after the fact, of drunken sprees and sexual adventures with Indians and prostitutes. The mining camps in the southern mines where the Latin Americans and Frenchmen worked had a more normal balance of the sexes and morals. Yankees from the northern mines frequently went south for a visit to see women dancing. Other Sunday amusements included bull and bear fighting, where the two animals were chained together and prodded to fight to the death. Most mining camps had arenas to accommodate the crowds assembled for the blood sport. Occasionally, bullfighting took place when a brave individual ventured into the ring. In Sonora Camp, Enos Christian recalled seeing a female matador who turned out to be a man dressed as a woman for the crowd's amusement. A few sought out the comforts of religion, although churches were few and far between. In the southern mines, rude Catholic churches sprang up, and diverse nationalities and classes gathered. For the Protestant miners, the occasional preacher and denominational church provided the chance to share the Christian gospel and perhaps view a member of the opposite sex. Historian Susan Lee Johnson called the Gold Rush the most demographically male event in human history. By 1850, California men outnumbered women by more than 10-1. 2 years later, the ratio fell to 7-1, and by 1860, it was 2-1. It was not until the turn of the century that a balance between the sexes was achieved. The first women to live and work in the mining camps were California Indians, who worked as prostitutes or held other jobs in the saloons and temporary brothels that sprang up. They were followed by Sonoran Mexicans such as Rosa Feliz, companion of the legendary Joaquin Murrieta, or Latin Americans such as Chilean Rosario Amestica, a prostitute who sailed north with a shipload of men. Some women were reformers. Elizabeth Gunn, who was married to the editor of the Sonora Herald, wrote home about the evils of the fandango and prostitution, and soon her husband's paper published criticisms along those lines. Lorena Hayes wrote and published under the pen name Lanita to criticize the immorality of the mining camps, even while identifying with the Mexican and Chilean miners. Wives and prostitutes thus were uneasy companions in the mining camps. Single entrepreneurial women also found their niche. Gold dust was a lure to women such as Rose Cartier, a French woman who owned a saloon in the mining camp of Sonora, where she employed other women who had emigrated from France and Europe. Married women who travelled to the gold towns and settlements with their husbands endured many hardships and sufferings. Mrs. John Berry arrived in the camps in 1849 with her husband and lived in a wagon and a tent through the cold, wet winter. She wrote, "The rains set in early November and continued with little interruption until the latter part of March. Sometimes on a morning, I would come out of the wagon, that is and has been our bedroom ever since we left the States, and find my utensils lying in all directions, fire out and it pouring down." Women tried to set up housekeeping among the dirt, fleas, dust, cold and wet. Louisa Clapp came to California with her husband in 1850, then travelled to the mines with him and wrote 23 letters to her sister, which she signed Dame Shirley. These Shirley letters were published serially in 1854 and again in 1933, and are perhaps the most vivid and detailed first-hand description of women's daily life in the diggings. She wrote of the log cabin they called home and the few other women who lived nearby. Her detailed observations of the people she met and the mining camps are a classic in gold rush literature. Through it all, Louisa remained indefatigable and optimistic. Sometime in 1852 she wrote, "My heart is heavy at the thought of departing forever from this place. I like this wild and barbarous life. I leave it with regret." A characteristic of the gold camps noted by Dame Shirley was the tolerance of prostitutes, whom she termed compassionated creatures. Most of the men of the gold rush were white men, and most of the prostitutes were Mexican, Chinese, Chilean or Indian. Historian Al Hurtado found that more than 3/4 of the prostitutes in Sacramento were women of color, and more than half of them were Chinese. The southern mines especially had a multiracial, multinational female population, including African Americans and Indians. One of the most infamous tragedies of the gold rush era was the hanging in 1851 of Josefa, the only woman ever lynched in California. Josefa, also known as Juanita, her last name is not known, lived in Downeyville with her boyfriend Jose, a Mexican gambler. During the night of a 4th of July celebration, a miner named Fred Cannon drunkenly fell into the couple's humble shack and broke the door. The following day, when Jose and Juanita demanded payment for the damage, an argument ensued, and Cannon called Josefa a prostitute. Soon after, in a rage, she killed him with a Bowie knife. That afternoon, a mob assembled, demanding that she be hanged and voting to execute her at 4 o'clock. Before she died, Josefa calmly arranged the noose around her neck so that it would not tangle her hair and coolly told the assembled rabble that she would do it all over again. She had defended her honour. Cannon had called her a prostitute. Women worked for high wages doing domestic chores for the miners, including cooking, sewing and laundry. Other women owned and operated stores, restaurants, saloons and gambling and boarding houses. Some unmarried women lived with miners in an attempt to avoid the violence and insecurity that was a constant fact of female life. However, respectable women did not stay unmarried for very long, and those who came to the mines as married women were under great temptation to find new husbands among the wealthy or to seek less abusive, more attentive mates. Because of the scarcity of women, divorce statutes drafted by the California legislature were more liberal than elsewhere. Divorce became more common for women than for men, and beginning in the 1880s, California led all other states in the proportion of divorce to married couples. Nativism and racism. One of the negative legacies of the gold rush was the wave of anti-foreign sentiment that emerged, directed especially toward non-European immigrants. The Latin Americans, especially the Peruvians, Chileans and Mexicans, along with the French and Chinese, became favourite targets of political agitation and violence in California. Most Mexican and Latin American miners established themselves in the southern mines, including the California counties south of the Sacramento River. Most of the anti-Mexican violence occurred here. Mexican, Californio and Latin American miners helped teach the newly arrived Americans how to extract the metal from stream beds and ore deposits. But the gratitude they received for these lessons was short-lived. Resentment about the presence of these foreigners soon erupted into violence, especially in 1849, when the Americans arrived in larger numbers. Americans were angry that many of the best claims had been staked out already by the Sonorans, as they called all Mexican miners. The fact that many of the mining towns like Sonora, Hornitos and Stockton had become multilingual in business dealings grated on the English-speaking Americans, who regarded this development as unpatriotic. On July 4, 1849, acts of violence broke out against the foreigners, beginning with attacks on Chilean merchants and neighborhoods in San Francisco, and then spreading to the mining camps. Yankee miners ousted the Chileans in the camps near Stockton by creating an impromptu code of laws forbidding foreigners from mining. Intimidation and violence followed, and the Anglos confiscated the Chileans' property and sold it at public auction. In November 1849, a vigilante group attacked Mexican miners along the Calaveras River, ousted them from their claims and fined each miner an ounce of gold. A few days later, 16 Chileans were rounded up and accused of murder. They were given a summary trial, and then 3 were lynched. Similar acts of violence occurred throughout the diggings during the first few years of the gold rush. Many native-born Mexican Americans, who were now citizens of the United States under the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, fell victim to these anti-foreign prejudices and laws. One estimate places about 1,300 Californios, formerly Mexican citizens, now US citizens, in the gold regions in 1848, with a similar number returning in 1849. In 1849, the military governor of California, General Percival Smith, responded to nativist fears that 4 designers were taking all of the gold out of the mining regions. He announced his trespass orders, prohibiting non-citizens from mining gold on public property. He appealed to Americans to help him enforce his policy. Using this order as a pretext, and with some protection from the military, Anglo-American miners robbed and harassed foreigners. After one riot, French immigrant miners were driven from the gold camps. Irish and Australians became targets of vigilante violence in San Francisco and elsewhere in the diggings. Chinese miners attracted more and more attention from nativists, and many were driven out of the gold camps by late 1851. In April 1850, the California legislature responded to the pressure from the 49ers and passed the foreign miners' tax, which required all non-US citizens to pay a tax for the privilege of mining gold. The cost was $20 per month, so high as to be prohibitive to all but the most successful. The law applied to all non-citizens. Tax collectors enforced it most consistently for miners whose language or race made them distinctive. Chinese and Latin Americans especially, but also the French and Germans. The tax was repealed the next year, due partly to complaints by gold country merchants that it was destroying their businesses. In 1852, the legislature passed a new foreign miners' tax of $4 per month, later changed to $3. Another amendment in 1855 exempted all those who declared their intention to become citizens from the tax. This meant that the tax was limited almost entirely to Chinese miners, because they alone could not qualify for an exemption. California's constitution limited citizenship to whites only. Until a law 1870 voided the tax, it provided a major source of state revenue. Of the $5 million collected over 20 years through this tax, Chinese miners paid an estimated $4.9 million. Leaders of the Chinese community voiced their opposition to these discriminatory laws and others that were proposed, but as non-citizens they had little political influence in Sacramento. Nevertheless, members of the Chinese community protested by writing letters to the governor and San Francisco's newspapers. They also hired a lobbyist, a Presbyterian minister named A.W. Loomis, to fight against discriminatory laws, particularly those restricting their testimony in court. The Chinese won court victories challenging the foreign miners' tax and other prejudicial laws by hiring lawyers and collectively funding court challenges. The legendary life of Joaquin Murrieta. One of California's first folk legends was Joaquin Murrieta, whose life is subject to controversy, speculation, and myth. According to the story, Murrieta was a Sonoran miner in Murphy's Camp, whose brother was lynched and whose wife was raped and murdered. What followed was Joaquin's war of revenge against the Americanos. For a year, Joaquin and a band of Mexicanos and Californios terrorized the state. As a result, California created the California Rangers, a special mounted police force modeled on the Texas Rangers. The state government placed a price of $1,000 on Murrieta's head. In 1851, after several months of searching the foothills for Murrieta, Captain Harry Love and the Rangers surprised a group of Mexican vaqueros in Cantua Canyon. The Rangers killed several Mexicans, and Captain Love claimed that one of them was Joaquin. To prove his claim, he chopped off Murrieta's head and brought it back for identification. Even though Love gathered several testimonials certifying that the head was indeed Joaquin's, some doubted that Murrieta had been killed. To this day, many believe that Joaquin escaped and returned to his home in Sonora, Mexico. Thus, Joaquin Murrieta became one of California's first legendary figures. The first fictional interpretation of his life, based on some historical fact, was The Life and Adventures of the Celebrated Bandit Joaquin Murrieta by John Rollins Ridge, published in 1854. Ridge was a Cherokee Indian whose native name was Yellowbird. In Ridge's hands, Joaquin became a vicarious avenger, a Robin Hood of the Sierra. Joaquin's adventures reappeared in other novels and histories and rapidly became an international legend. As late as the 1960s, Joaquin Murrieta's story inspired resistance against American cultural and economic control. In revolutionary Cuba and communist Russia, Murrieta appeared in textbooks and life-size statues as an example of the revolt of the Third World against imperialism. The world-famous Chilean poet Pablo Neruda composed an epic poem in which Murrieta was a Chilean who stood for the struggle of all Latin American people to be free of North American hegemony. At the same time, however, Anglo-American novelists, history buffs, and some academics treated Murrieta as an overly romanticized bloodthirsty bandit murderer or as a fictitious character whose life is more properly a topic of literary study. This contradictory and ambiguous legacy springs from the gold rush in California. California transformed. The military conquest of California was swift, taking less than 6 months. However, the social, economic, and cultural conquest was a more gradual process catalyzed by the gold rush and subsequent economic development. California's oldest inhabitants' cultural and social transformation was a protracted struggle spanning several decades as the newcomers gradually established dominance over the people and the land. Conquest of the Californios. The Californio landholders also paid a price for the development of California during the gold rush. In 1846, roughly 10,000 Mexicans, including Hispanicized Indians, lived in California. Within a few years, they were loved for dark-skinned people with their strange language and culture. The Californios swiftly lost control of the courts, government, and their land. Within a generation, the Mexican Californians lost political influence and became an impoverished minority, victimized by racist attitudes and laws. In 1855, for example, the state legislature passed laws to control the Mexican population. A Sunday law imposed fines ranging from $50 to $500 for engaging in barbarous or noisy amusements, listed as bullfights, cockfights, horse races, and other traditional California amusements. At the same time, they passed what was widely called the Greaser Law to fine and jail unemployed Mexicans who were considered vagrants. Conquest of the Indians. The modernization of California's economy came at a cost, largely borne by the native and Mexican peoples, whose way of life was seen by the new immigrants as standing in the way of progress. The California Indians, who had been subject to the Spanish and Mexican attempts to change them, now fell victim to the new immigrants, most of whom thought of Indians as laborers, obstacles to settlement, or dangerous savages. During the early years of the gold rush, retaliatory massacres occurred when Indians occasionally killed whites, even though outrages against Indians may have provoked such killings. At Clear Lake in Northern California in 1849, for example, 135 Indians were killed in retaliation for the killing of 2 white men who had enslaved local Pomo Indians. Indian massacres took place sometimes just because the Indians were living in the vicinity. In 1850, more than 60 Humboldt Indians, men, women, and children, were killed as they slept in their village because they occupied property thought to be rich with gold. The state legislature appropriated millions in funds to pay for militia operations against Indians. When the Indians fought back, their resistance was termed war by the American settlers. In 1851, the so-called Mariposa War resulted when the Indians of this Northern California band fought to preserve their land and defeated the local militia until reinforcements arrived from outside the region. During that conflict, American settlers first entered Yosemite Valley when they pursued the Indians into their stronghold. That same year, a rebellion broke out in Southern California. This uprising resulted from an alliance between several Indian bands, perhaps protesting the American taxation of their lands and resenting the treatment of the Cupeño Indians by Juan José Warner. Their leader was Antonio Gara, an ex-neophyte Indian who sought an alliance with disaffected Californios. However, the Californios did not support his rebellion, and the state militia captured Gara with the help of rival Indian bands. He and 6 of his associates were tried and executed. Economic transformation. Without a doubt, the gold rush was one of the great turning points in California's history, redefining the state's demographic, economic, and social future. The lure of precious metal drew hundreds of thousands of immigrants to California and assured the rapid domination of the English-speaking people. By 1850, the population of California exceeded 150,000, allowing the territory to apply for admission as a state. California gold helped finance the North in the U.S. Civil War, stimulated the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, and encouraged the state's rapid agricultural and commercial development. It is estimated that in the 25 years following the discovery at Coloma, miners extracted more than $1 billion worth of gold from the mines, the equivalent of more than $100 billion at the end of the 20th century. The mining industry stimulated demand for food and materials, stimulating the home industry and creating new cities and towns. Sacramento and Stockton owed their creation to the gold rush, and San Francisco became a major international metropolis. The newcomers and their exuberance created a boom mentality within the state. The expectation of quick riches, opulent displays of wealth, a fluid and open society, and colourful and eccentric individuals became early hallmarks of California's American era. California became the Western leader in banking, agriculture, stock raising, industrial development, and trade, a lead that has lengthened over the decades. The Golden State. During the hectic first 2 years of the gold rush, the military governed California. Still, the American residents protested this situation and held mass meetings to demand that a civil government be organized. Bowing to public pressure, Military Governor General Bennett Riley issued a proclamation calling for the election of delegates from 10 districts. These delegates were to assemble in Monterey on September 1st, 1849, to work on constructing a state government for California. They were elected by popular vote on August 1st, 1849. The result was a group as diverse as the territory. Of the 48 men assembled in Colton Hall that fall, 8 were native Californios, 6 were foreign-born European immigrants, and 13 had been living in California less than a year. Deliberations were in English, with translators available for the Spanish-speaking delegates. Votes on many of the issues split along north-south lines. The southern delegates wanted territorial status, or, if impossible, splitting California into 2. They lost on both counts. The delegates were unanimous in wanting to exclude slavery from California and also to exclude free African Americans from the state. Many ex-slaves feared the threat of having to work as indentured servants in the mines. Finally, the provision specifically excluding them was deleted to get Congress to approve statehood speedily. In dealing with this issue, delegates relied on the precedents of free states in the East. Concerning citizenship rights, native Californios were aware that many Mexican Californios who looked like Indians faced the prospect of racial discrimination. Ultimately, they argued for the protection of their people, even though it meant endorsing the racist views of their Anglo colleagues toward Indians and persons of African descent. Mexico had granted citizenship to civilized Indians and to blacks, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo clearly stated that former Mexican citizens were to be allowed to become citizens of the United States. Following the biases of the time, the framers of the state constitution sought wording that would exclude African Americans and Indians while including Mexicans. Eventually, The first section of the state constitution limited the suffrage to every white male citizen of Mexico who shall have elected to become a citizen of the United States. The convention agreed that Indians and African Americans might at some future date be given the franchise, but that, because voting was not an absolute right of citizenship, they could be excluded. The Constitution left open the question of Indian citizenship, stating that nothing herein contained shall be construed to prevent the legislature, by a 2/3 concurrent vote, from admitting to the right of suffrage Indians or the descendants of Indians. Summary. Ultimately, the Mexican Californios became full-fledged citizens, at least in theory, when the Congress of the United States admitted California in 1850. Under the treaty's provisions, those who did not want to become U.S. citizens had a year to declare this intention. They were also free to go to Mexico. No one knows how many Mexican Californios returned, but during the early 1850s, several colonization expeditions went south and settled in Sonora and Baja California. Of course, the main issue in California was possession of the land, but the proposed constitution was silent in this regard. The former Mexican citizens had to trust their fate to the courts and their interpretation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. As Chapter 5 explains, their trust was quickly betrayed as the U.S. government established complicated and lengthy procedures for verifying legitimate title to the land. Thus, most Californios had to mortgage or sell their lands to pay for litigation costs. Within a generation, most of the Californio rancheros joined the impoverished ranks of their former vaqueros. The Constitutional Convention also debated where to set the state's eastern boundary. Mexican maps had never specified an eastern boundary, and some argued that California included the states of Nevada and Utah. The Southern delegates argued that this territory would be too difficult to administer and might prevent ratification by Congress. The final agreement established the eastern boundary, roughly following the Sierra Nevada mountains. Several sections in the state constitution showed Mexican influence. One provision, for example, required that all laws be published in Spanish and English to recognize the Mexican minority. California also adopted the concept of community property, wherein married women had joint property ownership with their husbands, as they had under Mexican laws. Mariano Vallejo, one of the Californio delegates, protested that the state flag and seal should not show a grizzly bear, a reminder of the Bear Flag Rebellion and his humiliation. Still, his objections did not win a sympathetic hearing. The U.S. Congress accepted California's constitution after a lengthy debate that resulted in the Compromise of 1850. The state government established by California's admission on September 9, 1850, promised to bring some degree of law and order to the politically ambiguous situation created by a military government. Still, the lawlessness engendered by the gold rush continued in many areas.